I recently read Yesteryear by Caro Claire Burke, and while I loved the premise, I don't think it lived up to it. So today I'm recommending 6 books that take those same ideas and do them better. Yesteryear touches on themes like the tradwife movement, influencer culture, traditional gender roles, motherhood and nostalgia. But for me, it never really committed to any of them. It felt as if it was trying to pack in too many ideas without properly exploring any of them. Howdy book lovers, my name's Anita, and if you were disappointed with Yesteryear, then here are some books to try instead. So the first book I want to recommend is Nightbitch by Rachel Yoder. This book follows an exhausted stay-at-home mother who becomes convinced that she's turning into a dog. Which sounds ridiculous. I mean, it is ridiculous, but it's also one of the most emotionally honest books that I've ever read about motherhood. One of the things that Yesteryear touches on is this romanticised vision of womanhood, the idea that women are somehow fulfilled by traditional domestic roles. And Yesteryear isn't arguing that that's true, but it doesn't really interrogate the idea either. Nightbitch absolutely does. It asks what happens when motherhood consumes your entire identity, when you're exhausted all the time. Your career's disappeared, nobody sees you anymore, and you're left wondering if you've become something less than human. The genius of this book is that the absurd premise makes these emotions feel even more real. The transformation into a dog isn't just there for the sake of being weird. It becomes a metaphor for rage, instinct, isolation, and the loss of self. It's not a hook just for the sake of being a hook, like the time travel in Yesteryear. What I also love is that Nightbitch completely embraces female rage instead of trying to soften it or repress it like in Yesteryear. Women are so often expected to be endlessly patient, nurturing and self-sacrificing, and this novel gives its protagonist permission to be angry about what's been taken from her. Not because she doesn't love her child, but because motherhood has consumed every other part of her identity. That anger isn't treated as something shameful or something to be fixed. It's presented as a completely understandable response to impossible expectations. And I found that so much more honest than stories that pretend motherhood is either entirely joyful or entirely miserable. And unlike Yesteryear, which often felt restrained and like the messiness was happening off camera, in Nightbitch the messiness is right there. It's funny, it's gross, it's uncomfortable, and because of that, it ends up saying more about motherhood than a more realistic novel could. I laughed so much more reading Nightbitch than Yesteryear. The humour lands because it grows naturally out of the absurdity, rather than undercutting the emotional moments. Nightbitch was a 5-star read for me, and if you're interested in books about motherhood that refuse to sugarcoat the experience, I can't recommend it highly enough. My next recommendation is The Vegetarian by Han Kang. And I love this book way more than I expected to. The Vegetarian is about Young-hee, who decides one day that she's just not going to eat meat anymore. That's it. That's the decision. And that one small act of refusing to conform completely unravels her life. This book isn't actually about vegetarianism. It's about what happens when a woman stops performing the role that society expects of her. It's told through 3 different perspectives, but never through Young-hee herself. And that works so well because it's not a book about understanding her or the reasons why she becomes a vegetarian. It's about how everyone projects their expectations onto her, how everyone around her feels entitled to control her body. Her husband, her family, people who are supposed to care about her, and the way they treat her over a decision which doesn't affect them at all. It's a book that perfectly communicates the violence of conformity. Like Yesteryear, it's a book that discusses traditional gender roles, but The Vegetarian is so masterfully written that it feels unfair to compare them. The Vegetarian knows exactly what it wants to say, and every single element of the novel, from the structure to the symbolism to the prose, is working toward that goal. My dog wants to come in just a sec. This was another very easy 5-star read for me, and if traditional gender roles were the aspect of Yesteryear that interested you the most, then this is the first book I'd recommend instead of reading that. The next recommendation is probably the least surprising one on this list, but I couldn't make a video about books that explore restrictive gender roles without including The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. If you've somehow never heard of it, it's set in a near-future America where a theocratic regime has stripped women of all their rights and reduced fertile women to reproductive vessels. It's a harrowing read, but it's a total banger. I would say unputdownable. It's basically the book that Yesteryear wishes it was. One of Yesteryear's main themes is the appeal of traditional gender roles and the tradwife movement in particular. The problem I had was that it never seemed sure what it wanted to say about it. It was just like, here's a thing, look. And you're left like, okay, so what? The Handmaid's Tale doesn't have that problem. It knows exactly what it wants to say, and every part of the book is working toward that. Like The Vegetarian, seeing a theme here. It's interested in how societies control women, how those systems are maintained, and how ordinary people adapt to that system, how they justify it and even help sustain it. And because it has such a clear focus, every scene in The Handmaid's Tale feels purposeful. It's one of the best novels about gender and power ever written, and it's still scarily relevant 40 years after it was published. Flawless book. Chef's kiss. If the thing that appeals to you about Yesteryear is the time travel, then I would say read Kindred by Octavia E. Butler instead. It's more focused on race than gender, but where Yesteryear uses the past as part of the hook, Kindred explores what it would actually be like to live there. So Dana is suddenly pulled back in time from the 1970s and experiences the antebellum South as a black woman. It's exactly as brutal and tense as you would expect. You're constantly reminded that the past isn't just a setting, it's a system. It shapes every interaction, every relationship, every decision. Kindred never lets time travel become escapism. Dana knows exactly what's waiting for her every time she's pulled back, and so do you as the reader. There's no sense of adventure because history isn't being treated as entertainment, it's being treated as something that people actually lived through. Going back in time isn't exciting, it isn't romantic, it isn't an opportunity to experience history from a safe distance. It's terrifying. I think that's what separates Kindred from Yesteryear. They both ask, what would it be like to step into another time? But they're asking that question for completely different reasons. Where Yesteryear is more interested in the fantasy of the past, Kindred wants to dismantle that fantasy. The past feels lived in and believable, it's messy and frightening, and it never lets you forget that history was lived by real people. If you're looking for a historical time travel novel with something meaningful to say about the past rather than simply using it as a backdrop, I would absolutely recommend Kindred. Then, back to the modern day, my next rec is A Touch of Jen by Beth Morgan. Okay, so this book's about a couple, Remy and Alicia, who become increasingly obsessed with Jen, who's a woman that they barely know but have built an entire fantasy around through social media. This book gets weird, but underneath all the surrealism is a really sharp exploration of social media, parasocial relationships, and the way we perform our lives online. One of the things I found frustrating about Yesteryear is that it introduces influencer culture as one of its central ideas, but it never really digs into it. It recognises that social media exists. It recognises that people present idealised versions of themselves online, but it doesn't say much beyond that. A Touch of Jen has a lot to say. It asks why people become obsessed with influencers, why we convince ourselves we know them, why we project our own fantasies onto complete strangers, and why we feel entitled to these people's lives and sometimes even their bodies. And these themes never feel as if they're interrupting the story. They're woven into the narrative so naturally that by the time the book gets weird, it still feels emotionally truthful. And it's also just a fun read and a funny read. In Yesteryear, I kept waiting for something to happen, but A Touch of Jen never feels static. There's always a sense that the book's building towards something. So if the social media aspect of Yesteryear interests you, I would totally recommend A Touch of Jen instead. And if it's a book about tradwives that you want, and they do seem to be everywhere at the moment, then I would go for Everyone Is Lying to You by Jo Piazza. This book's a murder mystery set within influencer culture where polished online lives hide increasingly dark realities. One thing I appreciated is that it doesn't simply present tradwife culture as something ridiculous or reduce it to one stereotypical character. Instead, it spends time exploring why these communities exist, why people are drawn to them, and how they affect the women participating in them. That was something I felt missing from Yesteryear. Because Natalie was so socially isolated and so in her own head, you never really got to see her as part of the larger tradwife movement. Everyone's lying to it isn't perfect, and it doesn't pretend to dissect the tradwife ideology, but I do think it has more curiosity than Yesteryear. It went much more deeply into the performative nature of influencer culture, which I felt was a bit muddied in Yesteryear because of reasons that I can't say because it's a spoiler. This book also talks more about how these women become brands and the business side of it all, which I found quite interesting. And because it's all wrapped up in a murder mystery, it's also just a really entertaining read. Would this normally have been something I would pick up? Probably not. I read it specifically because I was making this video, but I'm glad I did because I think it explores this corner of influencer culture much more thoughtfully than Yesteryear. I also wanted to mention one non-fiction book that feels relevant to this conversation, even though I haven't personally read it, and that's The House of My Mother by Shari Frankie. If you followed the Ruby Frankie case, this is her daughter Shari's memoir about growing up inside one of YouTube's most famous family channels and what life was actually like behind that carefully curated image. I think it fits this conversation because one of Yesteryear's central ideas is the way that social media can package traditional femininity and family life into something aspirational, and what can happen when that image becomes more important than the people living inside it. Again, I haven't read it, so I can't personally recommend it the same way that I can the other books in this video, but if you're looking for a non-fiction exploration of those ideas, then this does seem worth checking out. So those are the books I'd recommend instead of Yesteryear. They're books with similar ideas and themes rather than similar plots, but they explore those ideas more deeply and they have something meaningful to say about them. If you've read Yesteryear, I'd love to know what books you'd recommend instead. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Otherwise, stay weird and I'll see you in the next one. What do you think of my new haircut? Do you think it's a bit too Karen-y? I'm worried it's a bit Karen-y.